Dane Holloway had never expected that a small, trembling alien cub could make a man question everything he knew about loyalty, compassion, and fate. The station was quiet, almost eerily so, a forgotten outpost on the edge of the Perseus expanse, where supply ships rarely stopped and the echoes of abandoned corridors whispered of lost crews and past conflicts. Dane had come for work routine repairs, data logs, and a paycheck that barely covered his passage home. But life, he would soon discover, had a way of pulling him into stories far larger than any he imagined. He first noticed it during the evening shift, when the hum of the station's life support became the only sound accompanying his footsteps down the maintenance corridors. At first he thought it was a trick of the lights, shadows stretching and warping in the dull glow of the overhead panels. Then he saw it tiny crouched behind a supply crate, its fur shimmering faintly with an iridescent glow. Its eyes, molten gold and impossibly intelligent, met his. For a moment, Dane froze. This was not a creature he had ever seen in the Dominion files, or in any smuggler's tales of the outer colonies. The cub's body shook, not from cold, he realized, but from hunger and fear. Its ribs were visible under its sleek fur, and every motion it made seemed desperate, as if it were a ghost struggling to stay tethered to life. Dane's first instinct was caution. Station regulations forbade harboring alien lifeforms, and the Ashrin Dominion had long been considered a volatile, imperial species whose members were forbidden on human outposts. But the cub was small, defenseless, and something about the way it looked at him, it struck a chord deep within. He reached into his pack and pulled out the small ration bars he had intended to save for himself. They were barely enough for a day, maybe two, but he broke one in half and extended it toward the trembling creature. The cub tilted its head, sniffed the air, and then, with surprising boldness, took a cautious step forward. Its claws were tiny but sharp, catching slightly on the worn floor panels as it closed the distance. When it finally reached him, it nuzzled his hand, its warmth and trust radiating through Dane's own chest in a way he had never felt. The moment was brief. A sharp alarm echoed through the station, jolting him from the fragile peace. Security drones whirred into life, and distant voices shouted commands in languages he barely understood. Dane cursed under his breath. Harboring alien creatures was one thing. Getting caught with one was another entirely. He scooped the cub into his arms, feeling the rapid beat of its small heart, and ran toward the maintenance shafts, weaving through narrow passages and service lifts that hadn't seen a human in years. Even as he ducked behind panels and climbed through forgotten vents, he marveled at the creature's resilience. Despite its frailty, it clung to him as if it knew he was the only thing standing between it and certain death. And for a fleeting, impossible moment, Dane imagined what it would be like to see this tiny being grow into something magnificent, something capable of commanding legions. The thought made him smile, then made him feel a pang of guilt for thinking such thoughts while the alarms blared and his chances of escape dwindled. Finally, he reached the docking bay, a cavernous area bathed in pale light, where supply shuttles lay dormant like resting beasts. The cub squirmed slightly, sensing the imminent danger, and Dane whispered softly to calm it. Words meant more for himself than the creature. "I won't let them take you, I promise." He could see the armed guards approaching, their boots echoing on the metal floor, the tips of their rifles catching the light as they scanned for any sign of contraband life. Dane's mind raced. There was no time for strategy, only instinct. He ducked into a service elevator, pressing the override button with trembling hands. The doors slid shut just as the guards reached the docking bay, their voices a chorus of confusion and frustration. As the elevator ascended, Dane held the cub close, feeling the warmth of its tiny body against his chest, and a strange sense of connection settled over him. It was as if, in saving this one fragile creature, he had stumbled into a story far greater than himself, a story whose consequences he could not yet imagine. The elevator jolted, the lights flickered, and Dane caught a final glance at the docking bay below, now empty. The cub's golden eyes met his again, and for the briefest instant, he saw something that made his blood run cold. An excitement flare in equal measure, a spark of intelligence far beyond its size, a knowing that this meeting was not a chance encounter. Somewhere in the universe, fate had begun its long work, weaving paths that Dane could neither see nor escape, and as the elevator carried them into the unknown, he had no idea that 20 years later, that very cub would return, wearing a throne. 20 years had passed since Dane Holloway last saw the small cub he had saved on that desolate station, and yet the memory was burned into his mind as if it had happened yesterday. He had left the Outer Rim behind, moving from one routine assignment to another, his life unremarkable, predictable, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The bustling plaza of Terra's central port thrummed with energy, merchants hawking exotic goods from across the galaxy, and travelers hurrying to and fro, unaware that history was about to collide with legend. Dane navigated the crowd, unaware of the gazes that followed him, the whispers growing louder with every step. At first, he didn't see her. It was subtle, the way people stepped aside, the brief, reverent nods, the hushed murmur of recognition. Then he caught a glimpse of golden light, reflected off polished armor, a figure so tall and imposing it seemed almost unreal. Her presence commanded attention, radiating authority without a word. And yet there was something familiar in the intensity of her gaze. His breath caught. Could it really be? No, it was impossible. The cub he had fed had been tiny, defenseless, and now the crowd parted as she walked, and Dane's heart pounded as he saw her fully for the first time. She wore armor unlike anything he had ever seen. Sleek, alien, and yet intricately detailed with symbols of power he could barely comprehend. Her crown or throne-like diadem rested upon her head, shining like a fragment of a distant sun. Her eyes met his across the plaza, and in that instant, Dane felt a shock of recognition and disbelief, as if time itself had bent to bridge the gap between that long-ago moment and this one. He froze in place. It had to be her, Curison, a nearby trader whispered, almost in awe, the Warlord-Queen of the Ashrin Dominion. The words hit Dane like a wave, disbelief and dread mingling in equal measure. The tiny creature he had once held in his hands, trembling and desperate, had grown into a force capable of commanding entire fleets, entire civilizations. The implications of her presence were staggering. She had not just survived, she had flourished, rising to power in ways he could scarcely imagine. And now she was here, on Terra, and she was looking straight at him. As she drew closer, Dane's instincts screamed at him to move, to speak, to explain, and yet no words came. There was an intensity in her gaze, a weight of expectation that pressed against his chest. She stopped a few meters away, and the crowd seemed to vanish around them, as if the universe itself had focused its attention on this reunion. Every story he had heard of rulers and conquerors, of kings and queens, paled in comparison to the aura of inevitability surrounding her. Dane realized, with a jolt of fear and fascination, that the cub he had saved was no longer a helpless animal. She was a queen, a sovereign, and he had somehow become a part of her story. "You were always meant to be part of this," she said, her voice calm yet resonant, carrying an authority that made even seasoned officials nearby fall silent. Dane's mind raced. How could he explain 20 years of ordinary life to someone who had become extraordinary in every conceivable way? Yet, even in his fear and awe, there was a spark of recognition, a connection that transcended time and distance. The golden eyes of the creature turned queen bore into his soul, and he realized that the moment of choice was already upon him before he could respond. A ripple of commotion surged through the plaza. Shouts, alarms, and distant flashes of light signaled something ominous. Dane glanced past her, seeing ships descending from the sky, dark and angular, moving with a precision that hinted at not just military might but also intent. They carried a message or perhaps a threat, and in that instant, Dane understood that the reunion was only the beginning. The world, the galaxy, and perhaps his very life were about to change forever. He looked back at Curison, and in her eyes, he saw both challenge and hope intertwined, and knew that the decisions he made in the next moments would ripple across stars. The golden light of her armor shimmered, reflecting not just the sun of Terra but the enormity of a fate that had waited 2 decades to arrive. Dane took a deep breath, preparing himself for the impossible, knowing that the cub he had once saved had returned not as a companion, but as a queen, a force of destiny, and the harbinger of challenges he had never imagined. And as the first distant cannons lit the sky, he understood one undeniable truth: nothing would ever be the same again. "You were always meant to be part of this," Kyrison's voice resonated, calm yet commanding, echoing with the weight of centuries Dane could barely comprehend. Dane's mind raced, struggling to grasp the enormity of what he faced. The cub he had saved as a boy, or rather, the creature turned queen, was no ordinary being. She commanded fleets, armies, and entire civilizations. And now she was here, on Terra, with a presence that demanded obedience and respect. Yet in her eyes, Dane saw something else, a spark of hope, a plea for trust, and an unspoken bond forged 20 years ago, before he could respond. A dark ripple of signals spread across the sky, and Dane felt a chill crawl up his spine. Enemy warships, sleek and angular, emerged from the orbiting sectors above the city, their weapons primed, their intent unmistakable. They belonged to an unknown faction, or perhaps a rogue branch of the Ashrin Dominion claiming Curison's throne by right of conquest and bloodline. Panic spread through the plaza as people scattered, but Dane stood frozen, realizing that this was more than a political confrontation. The stakes were cosmic, and failure could mean the annihilation of an empire, perhaps even humanity itself. Kyrison's gaze never wavered. She stepped closer, golden armor glinting under Terra's sun, and whispered, "You must decide, Dane. Accept the bond, or our worlds burn." Dane's heart raced. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every memory of the cub's helpless eyes surged back, mingling with awe at the being she had become. He realized that 20 years ago, he hadn't just saved a creature. He had unknowingly become entwined in a destiny that now demanded courage beyond imagination. The enemy fleet advanced, their ships slicing through the atmosphere like predators descending on prey. Kirisin signaled her own armada, which had emerged from hidden sectors, its formations precise, calculated, and deadly. Dane's human ingenuity surged forward in that moment. A spark of adaptability honed from years of survival on the fringes of civilization. He knew their technology was advanced, but predictable in some ways. Strategy, improvisation, and audacity might tip the scales in ways the aliens could not anticipate. Your mind thinks differently, Kirisin said quietly, a hint of admiration in her tone. That is why you are part of this. Dane swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. His life had been ordinary, yes, but ordinary humans possessed a flexibility the grandest alien empires often lacked. He began issuing rapid commands, rerouting drone defenses, manipulating power relays, and coordinating counterattacks. The alien warriors surrounding Kirisin glanced at him in surprise, then followed his lead, trusting instinctively in the human who had once nurtured the smallest of their kind. A flash of light lit the sky, followed by a shockwave that rattled the plaza. Dane realized the enemy had launched a boarding strike aimed directly at Kirisin's flagship. The Queen's golden eyes narrowed, and she raised her hand, summoning forces from across her fleet. But it was Dane's plan that would determine the first move, a risky infiltration, a diversion, and the sabotage of their central command nodes. He could see the hesitation ripple across the enemy ranks. Even the most seasoned commanders faltered when confronted with the unpredictable, when faced with the cunning of a human mind operating under pressure. Yet the danger was far from over. Messages from enemy captains began flooding the comms, taunting and threatening in languages Dane barely understood. The ground shook as orbital cannons fired, and the first wave of assault troops began descending onto Terra. Dane glanced at Kirisin. She was calm, resolute, and yet he sensed tension beneath her regal composure. They were racing against time, and every second could decide not only the fate of the Ashrin Dominion, but the survival of countless human colonies. As Dane prepared to lead the counteroffensive, he realized that the cub he had once saved had returned not only as a queen but as a challenge, a puzzle, and a partner in a battle that spanned star systems. Their destinies were now inseparable, and the next move he made could tip the balance toward triumph or destruction. The enemy fleet loomed larger, and the first boarding pods breached the city's outskirts, making one thing painfully clear: the fight had only just begun. The enemy fleet hung over Terra like a storm of metal and fire, their warships blotting out the sun, casting long shadows over the city where millions now trembled in fear. Dane Holloway's heart pounded in rhythm with the distant roar of plasma cannons. He had spent years surviving the edges of space, adapting to dangers humans were never meant to face. But nothing had prepared him for this, nothing except the small cub he had fed 20 years ago. That creature had grown into Kirisin, Warlord-Queen of the Ashrin Dominion, and now her throne rested among the stars, demanding loyalty and sacrifice. She stood beside him on the plaza's central platform, golden armor glinting in the haze of smoke and energy bursts, her eyes locked onto his. "The throne is mine by right," she said, voice steady yet edged with fire. "But without you, Dane, we may not survive this." Dane swallowed, feeling the enormity of her words settle over him like a weight he could not escape. Humanity was not prepared for this war. Not fully. But humans had something no alien empire could replicate: ingenuity, audacity, and the unpredictable spark of courage. He looked out at the sky. Enemy dropships were descending, and orbital cannons fired in violent arcs that scarred the clouds. Kirisin raised her hand, signaling her fleet to engage, and swarms of sleek Ashrin ships darted between the human vessels, their movements precise, synchronized, and deadly. Dane, however, focused on what the aliens could not anticipate. He directed energy nodes across the city to generate magnetic fields that disrupted incoming projectiles, rerouted drone defenses, and created decoy signals to confuse enemy sensors. Each move was calculated, audacious, and human in its unpredictability. The first wave of enemy boarding pods hit the city outskirts. Kirisin led her warriors into the fray with a grace and ferocity that left Dane awestruck. Her blades shimmered with plasma energy, cutting through armored troops with lethal precision. Yet she trusted him to orchestrate the larger strategy. Dane's hands moved rapidly over the control consoles, coordinating strikes, openings, and diversions with a speed that made even her soldiers pause in recognition. The cub he had once held had returned not only as a queen but as a partner in an unprecedented war, and for the first time in decades, Dane realized that his ordinary human adaptability might actually turn the tide. A massive explosion rocked the city as a central enemy ship attempted to land, aiming to crush the plaza where they stood. Kirisin's eyes flashed, and she leaped into the air, her thrusters carrying her across the battlefield as she cut through the first wave of attackers. Dane saw the opportunity he had been waiting for, a critical junction in the enemy's power grid exposed, vulnerable, yet heavily guarded. With a few precise commands and risky maneuvers, he infiltrated the ship's systems, redirecting energy flows, sabotaging their shields, and triggering a chain reaction that left the flagship crippled. The enemy fleet wavered, confusion spreading like wildfire through their ranks, even as chaos raged. Dane and Kirisin moved together seamlessly. She was the embodiment of strategy, strength, and authority. He was the spark of unpredictability, the human mind that could bend logic to his will. Their forces advanced, overwhelming the enemy in a symphony of precision and improvisation. Every strike, every maneuver, seemed orchestrated by fate itself. And then, standing on the bridge of the enemy flagship, Dane confronted the supreme commander, a being as massive and fearsome as legends had described. One calculated move, leveraging both human cunning and Kirisin's authority, brought the armada to its knees. The battlefield fell silent. Kirisin descended from her throne, stepping lightly onto the plaza beside Dane, her golden eyes reflecting not just triumph but a profound gratitude. "You didn't just save me," she whispered, her voice carrying over the hushed city. "You saved a kingdom." Dane's chest swelled with a mix of disbelief, awe, and pride. The cub he had once fed had returned not as a dependent or companion, but as a sovereign, a queen, and together they had reshaped the course of galaxies. For a moment, the stars themselves seemed to shine brighter, as if acknowledging that destiny had finally been fulfilled. Dane looked at Kirisin, realizing that the universe had conspired to bring them together, and that the small act of kindness he had shown decades ago had reverberated through time and space, returning to him in a glory he could never have imagined. And as the sun set over Terra, bathing the city in gold, he understood a simple truth. Some bonds are eternal, some choices echo across worlds, and sometimes the smallest acts can change the fate of empires. The battlefield was a storm of fire and energy, a symphony of destruction that stretched from Terra's orbit to the city below. Dane Holloway stood at the edge of the plaza, every nerve on fire, watching as the remnants of the enemy armada faltered under the combined might of Kirisin's fleet and his improvised defenses. He had never imagined that a simple act of compassion feeding a tiny, trembling alien cub would pull him into a war that spanned galaxies. Yet here he was, orchestrating the downfall of an enemy he could scarcely have conceived. Side by side with the creature he had once saved, Kirisin descended from her throne with unmatched grace, her golden eyes glowing brighter than the plasma streams that streaked the sky. Her armor reflected not only sunlight but the weight of centuries of leadership and loss. Every move she made was precise, elegant, and devastating. She had become more than a ruler. She was a force of destiny, a living embodiment of power and wisdom. And beside her, Dane realized, he was no longer just a human caught in events larger than himself. He was part of something greater, a partner in shaping the fates of entire civilizations. The enemy commander, a towering figure encased in dark alloy armor that seemed to absorb light, had retreated to the bridge of his flagship, the last vestige of organized resistance. The ship's hull shuddered as Dane's sabotage took effect, cascading explosions lighting up the void outside. Every calculation, every risk he had taken over the past hours now converged on this final confrontation. He and Kirisin approached the flagship, not with fear, but with a calm born of knowing that courage, strategy, and trust could turn the impossible into reality. Inside the bridge, the commander's eyes glinted with malice, but there was also recognition of the unpredictable spark that humans carried, of a mind that could think beyond rigid systems and hierarchies. Dane moved quickly, directing the few loyal enemy soldiers still aboard, turning their confusion into leverage. Kirisin struck with precision, disabling weapons and subduing key officers, all while leaving the commander exposed. It was a dance of intellect and power, human adaptability paired with alien might, a combination that the enemy had never anticipated. A single, calculated strike shattered the command console, sending sparks and shrapnel flying. The flagship shuddered, alarms blaring as systems failed one by one. Dane seized the moment, confronting the commander directly. Words were unnecessary. The human ingenuity and audacity that had guided every move spoke louder than any speech could. The commander faltered, realizing that brute force and legacy could not overcome the unexpected, the uncalculated, the human element. And in that instant, the battle was decided not by fleets, nor weapons, nor empires, but by courage, loyalty, and a bond forged decades ago. Outside, Kirisin's fleet completed the rout, and the surviving enemy vessels fled or surrendered. The plaza fell silent as dust and smoke settled, revealing a world that had been forever altered. Kirisin descended fully to the ground, her armor battered but radiant, and turned to Dane. Her gaze was no longer that of a ruler issuing commands. It was recognition, gratitude, and something deeper. She stepped forward, lowering the ceremonial crown she had worn into his hands. "You didn't just save me," she said softly, her voice carrying over the still warm air. "You saved a kingdom, and everything it stands for." Dane felt a strange warmth spread through him as he looked at the being who had once been a helpless cub, now a queen, a force of destiny, and the living symbol of the choices he had made. They had faced impossible odds together, rewritten the fate of galaxies, and forged a bond that transcended time, species, and the cruelty of chance. The city around them slowly recovered, its citizens looking on in awe and relief, whispering tales that would become legend. As the sun set over Terra, casting long golden rays across the horizon. Dane realized something profound. Acts of kindness, however small, could echo across decades and star systems. Decisions made in the quiet corners of forgotten stations could ripple outward to reshape the universe. And sometimes, a single human heart, combined with courage and loyalty, could stand alongside the mightiest of queens and change everything. He looked at Kirison, smiled, and knew without words that the cub he had once saved had returned, not just wearing a throne but carrying a destiny they would share, together, across the stars. The stars above seemed to shine brighter that night, as if celebrating the reunion of worlds, the triumph of courage, and the enduring truth that even in the infinite expanse of space, the smallest acts could leave the largest mark. Dane Holloway had fed a cub, and the universe had never been the same again.